And as the slide says, welcome to our class. And they're still there. Welcome to our class. We are glad that you're here, those here in auditorium, and also those who are watching online via Facebook and also on YouTube. Before we get into Genesis, and by the way, remember your lessons are on the podiums there in the back. You can pick those up. I want to remind you of our study of Acts. We do that every morning, Monday through Saturday, and we're going through the book of Acts, part of our Fundamentals of the Faith series. You can watch it at 7, or you can watch it anytime as a recording. If you want to receive that study guide, the study guides are right up here. You can pick those up yourselves. If you're watching online, just email me and request the study guides, and they're sent out every Tuesday of each week. Now, what's going to happen after we finish Acts? We're going to go to a very interesting study called Notes from Inside My Bible. I have got out my old Bible. I think it's ancient. It's got a lot of notes in it from lectureships I've attended, Bible classes, seminars, whatever. And I'm going to share lessons for you. Here's our Jacksonville friends. They're with us. Good morning. I'm going to share with you notes from inside my Bible, which I think is going to be quite interesting. Also, our other Bible class, in fact, Billy is doing it right now, is called Bible Investigation. It's one question submitted by the audience and an answer from the Bible for that question. If you watch Fundamentals of Faith, the study of Acts, if you watch Bible Investigation, you're going to spend roughly between 10 to 15 minutes a day studying from God's Word. I think that's a wonderful way to invest 10 to 15 minutes each and every day. Don't forget our family memory passage for this week. We are trying to learn 52 key Bible passages this year. I think this is a wonderful idea from the elders. The passage this week is from Luke chapter 12. Then he said to his disciples, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about the body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouses nor barns, and God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds?" Let's go ahead and look at 22 and 23 today, and we'll look at, Lord willing, 24 on Wednesday. Do you worry? Raise your hand, okay? Probably all of our hands should be going up. We do tend to worry from time to time. Now keep in mind, worry and concern is different. Concern is proper. We should be concerned about our children, our grandchildren. We should be concerned about what's happening in the world. But don't worry, because God has it. God has control, and we can depend on Him. Don't worry. When we worry and fret, Satan is scoring a victory over us, because worry undermines faith. Worry undermines faith. So, always have your concerns and do what you can to help your children and grandchildren. But don't just worry and fret and rub your hands and, what can I do? Because God is always in control. Always remember that. Let's continue on with Genesis. Now, we have started notebook number 2. If you don't have one of these notebooks, it's your fault, because there is a whole stack of them right there. So just grab your notebook and have it, and put your name on it. That way you'll know where it is, and you can even leave it there in the pew back. We're in a study now, the second part of Genesis. It's a study of Abraham's family. We're going to start with Abraham, which we did already. And we're going to go through his family. Abraham is very important in the book of Genesis. When we look at that great chapter of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, and it mentions all of those heroes of faith, which hero gets the most verses? It's Abraham. He gets double the verses of Moses, because Abraham is that model of faith. Now, did he have that faith from the very beginning? No. That faith had to grow. And we've already seen in chapter 12 a problem. His faith has to grow. And that brings us up to our review. And our review comes from chapter 12. And for this day, for this morning, I'm going to make it easy on you. I put the review up on the screen. Let's do our review. It comes from study 74. We're going to wrap up this study. Review of the last part of Genesis chapter 12. Let's look at some reflections on deliverance from Egypt. Remember what happened? Chapter 12 is two parts. Part 1 is that call of Abram, and he leaves Haran and goes to the promised land. And what does he do? He builds altars. He worships God. He's in close fellowship with God. But then conditions change. And instead of putting his faith in God, what does he do? He goes to Egypt during a famine. Has God promised a bed of roses for his followers? No. He's promised he'll be there for us. You know, sometimes God stills the storms of life. And sometimes he comforts his child. But he never leaves us. God's promises to his pilgrim covenant partners, Abram and his family, are not intended to bring quiet and repose. It's not supposed to be an easy life. Why? Because suffering is a necessary part to bring perfection. Suffering reminds you how much you need God. It's easy to get too big for your britches. Now, I'm not talking about gaining weight, which I have. She's the guilty person. She does all the cooking. And I eat. What I'm talking about when I say getting too big for your britches, I'm talking about thinking too much of yourself. It's easy when everything's going great to think you've got it and, hey, I'm the master of my own ship. Sometimes we need to be knocked down to build ourselves up. Suffering is a necessary part of that process. It helps us from becoming selfish. It helps us to realize, hey, there's other people out there that I need to help. This also helps to develop virtues. First, faith, that's right. Hope. You know, if you've just got one lifeline, you put all your hope in that one lifeline. And that one lifeline is God. Patience. You wait for God to answer the prayers. And also it develops character. You know, in chapter 12, this scene of Abram turning his back on God. Keep in mind, in Egypt, it never mentions God. In Egypt, God is not mentioned. He does not build an altar. He does not communicate with God. The scene of Abram turning his back on God and turning to the bread of Egypt stands in contrast to a scene in Jesus' ministry. Do you remember that scene? Turn with me to Luke 4, real quick here. Luke chapter 4, verse 1. Then Jesus, being filled with the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan. You know, he's got a spiritual mountaintop. We went through that baptism with John. And he was led by the Spirit. God is helping his son here. Led by the Spirit into the wilderness. The wilderness is not a really pretty area, is it? You know, it's pretty wild. It's pretty barren. being tempted for 40 days by the devil. In those days he ate nothing. And afterward, when they had ended, he was hungry. Can you imagine that? I'm hungry if I miss one meal. Okay? 40 days? Yeah, I'm going to be really hungry. Devil said to him, if you, hey, a challenge, if, and you think you're the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread. But Jesus answered him, saying, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God. Think about how different our world would be if Abram had not went down to Egypt. The problems that resulted from his union with Hagar, and keep in mind, where did Hagar come from? She was an Egyptian. Where did Abram pick up Hagar? Answer, we do not know for sure. I would assume he picked up Hagar from Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh gave him all these things when he took Sarah into his harem. I would assume that Hagar probably came along at that time. Think about how different our world would be if Hagar had not come in contact with Abram. Where do the Arabic people come from? Well, from several sources, one being Ishmael. Where did Ishmael come from? Hagar. Think about how different our world would be if Abram had just put his faith in God. Let's continue our review. Ethics. The person of God frequently faces difficult decisions, difficult choices. Abram had a difficult choice here. He fears he can only escape death. How? He tarnishes his own honor. He has to have a pagan king, the Pharaoh, to rebuke him and point him in the right direction. He tarnishes his own honor through lies and by jeopardizing the honor and purity of his wife. Think about this thought question. Is being defiled better than death? He was afraid he was going to die up in the promised land. He was starved to death. Would Abram have starved to death in the promised land? Answer, no. No, God would have taken care of him. O ye of little faith. If we act out of fear, we are not acting out of faith. Romans 14, verse 23. But he who doubts, he who has fear, he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith. For whatever is not from faith is sin. Whatever is not of faith is what? Sin. Did Abraham, did he sin by going to Egypt? Yes, he did. You see, he is a man of faith, but he has to grow that faith. God's matchless grace. Even though Abram fails this test, this is the first test of faith and ethics, God proves faithful. 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. Even though we wander away, God doesn't leave. He is always faithful. Psalm chapter 103, verse 13. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. while Abram is rescued, he also loses. By the way, I got a spelling mistake there. Abram loses God's voice while in Egypt. He builds no altars. That's a loss. He brings no blessings. Remember that promise that God gave Abram? You're going to be a blessing on people. You see him blessing anybody here in Egypt? No. He brings no blessing on others. Instead of a blessing, he brings rebuke from a pagan king, Pharaoh. We also have a lot of foreshadowing here. Moses being the writer, he sees Abram using Egypt as a place of human shelter. Does that happen again in Genesis? Yes, it does. In fact, all of Jacob's family ends up being down in Egypt, human shelter. Also, Egypt is a place of danger. It was dangerous for Abram. Hey, go down there. The Egyptians may take my wife and kill me. When another Pharaoh came on scene, Exodus chapter 1, what happens? God's people suffer under the taskmasters. Abram's exodus is a foreshadowing of Israel's exodus, the book of Exodus. And also think about the plague. The very same word used here in chapter 12 for plague is the very same Hebrew word used for the 10 plagues that God brings on the Egyptians in the book of Exodus. Now, let's start our new material. Study number 75, the bad choice of Lot. Let's look at that bad choice. Genesis 13. Verse 1, we looked at Wednesday night. Notice, went up. Anytime you're going up, you're getting closer to God. Going down, like going down to Egypt, you're leaving God. He went up from Egypt, and notice how he's blessed. Even though Abram had sinned, God was still with him. He's blessed with all these possessions. He's somewhat a wealthy man. Verse 4, he goes back to the place of the altar. What are we doing? We are returning back to God. We have that departure from God at the end of chapter 12. Now we're going back with God. Now, Lot also. Lot is blessed by being in association with Abram. Who went with Abram, he had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great. Look at that word great. Circle that word great. Go back to verse 10 of chapter 12. Notice that word severe, very same Hebrew word. It's a contrast there. This is test number 2. Test number 1 was the famine. Test number 2 is you've got a lot of stuff. How can you get along with all your family? Verse 7. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now keep in mind, we got a lot of people here. Later on, we're going to see Abram having 318 soldiers to take. We assume he leaves some soldiers behind to protect Sarah and the rest of the family. You know, there could have been easily 1,500 people here in this little camp, in this little band. You know, you got the men soldiers, servants, you got the women, you got children. You got a lot of animals. We're not talking about some people that could fit in this building right here. We're talking about a massive amount of people. And they got a little problem. The land is not big enough where they're camping to support both halves. And keep in mind, Lot, even though he was the nephew, because Haran, Abraham's brother, was so much older than Abraham. Lot could have been close to the same age of Abraham. Even Lot, if Haran was 30, Lot could have been even older, as much as 20 years older than Abram. In the Hebrew, we don't know for sure. But we got two men here, and their camps are not getting along. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are what? I'm treating you as a brother. Technically, you don't have the right. Technically, I'm control. Technically, I could tell you what to do. You take that over there. You're stuck with that. I get first choice." But no, he's treating Lot not as a nephew, but as a brother. "Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. You get first choice. I'm going to be generous," he says to Lot. "I'll give you first choice." And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plains of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan. And Lot journeyed east. Anytime you see the direction of east, every example that I know of except one, that means bad, okay? If you're traveling east, that means bad. And they separated from each other. Now, let's continue on. Oh, by the way, if you do have a question, please send me your question. I got one already. Appreciate that. If you do have a question, notice on the flip side of your study guide is my cell phone number. Just text me a question and I'll include it here on our feed for Facebook and YouTube. Let's look at the plot and character development here in chapter 13. It's a big one. In fact, it's really big. In the previous scene, the plot's tension arose out of the severity of famine. What would Abraham do? Here, the plot tension arises out of prosperity. On a deeper level, the plot tension involves a test. Just like chapter 12 was a test, chapter 13 is a test. It's a test of character for both Abram and Lot. Who will prove to be the worthy covenant partner? So what? Practical applications for living today. God hasn't changed. God opens up doors of opportunity, situations that we fall into, that we encounter. Will we rise to the test? Will we rise to the test? Some friends of mine had identical twin sons. I've mentioned them before. Identical means they were one egg that separated. So basically, you look at those two boys, you couldn't tell them apart. Okay, they were identical. One today is a very faithful Christian leader in his home congregation. The other twin son has been in and out of jail more times than I can count. They had a test. They had a test. They chose different answers. We have tests. Will we choose God or will we choose the world? Let's continue on. The scene begins and ends with Abram at an altar. Look here at verse 3 and 4. He's at an altar. Look now over at verse 18 of chapter 13. Once again, he's at an altar. What's Moses trying to get across to us? Worship. Fellowship with God. Hey, that's Abram's life. That's what he is leaning toward. He's growing in his faith. Altar. Let's talk about those altars. The building of altars in chapter 13, in this scene, is the key to Abram's spiritual triumph. In Egypt, when Abraham feared for his life and doubted God's promise, there's no altars. But in this scene from Genesis 13, the altars signify his return to faith and also his proclamation of claiming the land in the name of God. Now, circle that phrase, in the name of God. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So what? Practical applications for living today. Do you boldly stand up for God? Here, Abraham, surrounded by the Canaanites, is standing up for God. People knew what he was doing. Remember, he would not even use their altars. He built his own because their altars are not good enough for God. I've got to put forth the effort. I've got to build the altar. I'm not going to take some secondhand altar and use it to worship my God. Do we stand up for God? Do people realize where we stand? Will we stand up for God? I had a person say this to me. Michael, I would share some of our Bible videos, but I don't because I'm afraid people will ask me questions about God, about His church, about the Bible. Is that not what we want them to do? Isn't it even better to start a Bible conversation if the other person starts it for you? Yeah, maybe you won't know the answer. Do I know all the answers? Does Billy know all the answers? Do the elders know all the answers? No, we don't. But we will look and search and study and get you the answers. So if someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, say, hey, I don't know how to answer that question, but I'll contact Billy or Michael or an elder and I'll get you the answer to your question. Abraham boldly stood up for God. He hid from God and from the people down in Egypt. What are we doing? Hiding or standing? Contrast. Three big contrasts. Three contrasts here in chapter 13 underscores Abram's faith. First contrast is the contrast between Abram and Pharaoh's palace. He's out of the land of blessing. That's Genesis 12:15. He's living the life of luxury. And then Abram in a nomad's tent in a land of blessing. Think about going from Pharaoh's palace, living there, living in the land of luxury, to living as a nomad in a tent. How many want to live in a tent? It's okay for a weekend camping trip. Would you want to live in a tent all your life? To the best of our knowledge, Abraham lived his life. After he left Ur and Haran, he lived his life in a tent for the rest of his life. That's a contrast there. A big contrast. Number 2, contrast. Abraham's faith and courage in the land is contrasted with his own what? He was just being a big old coward. Just paint a big old yellow streak down his back when he was in Egypt. We got a contrast there. The third contrast is Abraham's faith that God would provide is contrasted with Lot's what? His foolishness in choosing what looked good on the outside. Now, foreshadowing here in chapter 13. A lot of foreshadowing. Moses loves to foreshadow. Moses underscores the folly of Lot's choices by framing his decision with two remarks. Go back, look at chapter 13, verses 10 through 13. Notice he foreshadows what will happen with Sodom and Gomorrah. The first remark anticipates God's destruction of the cities of the plain that Lot chooses, while the second notes their wickedness that causes the destruction, and that Lot, in unbelief, chooses to ignore. Was Lot aware of how wicked his neighbors were? Yes. Did he take steps to correct it? Doesn't seem like he did. He missed out on that opportunity. Now, as we're doing now with our future study of fundamentals of faith, I'm sharing with you some notes from inside my Bible. Let's look at Genesis 13, verses 3 through 7, and let's look at some actual notes from my Bible. Not this Bible, but the one that's fallen apart, that's back at the house. Okay, let's look at that one. Verse 3, he went. Whatever is in red is what is in the text of the Bible. He went. Socially, Abraham is a wealthy nomad, but he's an alien resident among the Canaanites. Now keep in mind, as we've already mentioned, Shem and Eber are still alive during the life of Abraham and serve as family connectors, taking this all the way back to Noah. Spiritually, Abraham is a pilgrim in quest of the heavenly vision of a holy land and city. In fact, that's the phrase that's used in the New Testament. A heavenly vision of a holy land and city. We are Abraham. We are pilgrims. Are we to be like the world? No, we're just traveling, like the song says, I'm just traveling through. I'm a pilgrim. Abraham was a pilgrim. Verse 3, to the place. To the place. What is Moses referring to here? Most likely, Abram is following watering sites and pasture land. This place also served as the sacred site. It will be very important to them, to the Hebrew people. Verse 4, Abram called on the name of the Lord. There is spiritual significance in the name of God. If I call out, hey you, well, who am I talking about? But I say, hey Alan, hey Travis, hey Reuben, you take note, hey, he's talking to me. Our names are important. That's the reason why my mother never called me Mike. My first name, James, comes back from a family tradition going back a long time. My middle name is Michael. My mother always called me Michael. My mother would politely correct you if you called me Mike. That's the reason why I've never used the name. Now, Mike is a fine name. Hey, it's a fine name. But my mother always called me Michael. And I like the EL ending. As I already told you what the EL ending means for Bible names. And Michael is definitely a Bible name. Name some of the names that man has used for Jehovah God. Name some of the names that God has given us for Him. It's interesting. I'm going to give you a little homework here. Google names for God. And if you do some searching there, you'll pop up a lot of different names. El Shaddai, El, always referring back to God. El Roy, Adonai. Those names describe God and what He does for us. Those names were special for the Hebrew people, and guess what? They're even special for us because they are in reference to our God. In fact, do a little research. I'm going to even give you more on top of that. Do a little research on the word Jehovah. How do we get that word, Jehovah? And what exactly does it mean? Do a little research on the names of the Lord. Abram called on the name of the Lord. What did Ananias tell Saul, later the name Paul, a name change, important. Arise and be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on the name. In the Roman Empire, each year that a Roman soldier re-upped for service, he had to call on the name of Caesar. He had to pledge his loyalty, his complete obedience to Caesar. Luke right there pins those words from Ananias using that same concept, and we are what? Pledging our obedience to the Lord when we are baptized. Verse 5, Lot. This one in my Bible, remember those pens I gave? I gave out about 100 pens. I hope you don't use them for filling out your grocery shopping list. I hope you're using those to save for your Bible because they're made to write in your Bible. Remember those note-keeping Bibles many of you purchased? In mine, I got Lot with a red, put it in red ink. I got a red ink, green ink, blue ink, and a black ink. I got Lot in red ink because he is so motivated by things, possessions. Lot is blessed. Why? Because he's associated with Abram. Why is Lot doing so well in the world? Because he is associated with Abram. You know, we are blessed by being associated with each other. It's a blessing for me to be associated with Ed. It's a blessing for me to be associated with John. It's a blessing for me to be associated with Festus. It's a blessing to me to be associated with all of you. Lot was reaping the benefits by his association with his uncle, Abram. Verse 6, land was not able to support them. Moses. You know, it's ironic that the problem is the severity of the blessing. That's why he uses the same word that he used over in chapter 12. We got a problem because God is so good to us that causes strife among the family. Verse number 7. Canaanites and Perizzites. I changed that sound right there. That's not actually Perizzites. Who were these people? Answer, we do not know a whole lot about these people. They were people that lived there, connected to the Canaanites. They were people that were not good people. The land around the Dead Sea was different back then. If you've been to Jericho, wonderful oasis. Think of Jericho, move Jericho on the edge of the Dead Sea. That's what you got with Sodom and Gomorrah. When God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it changed that part of the land. We have in recent years done some, I say we, people who are in the archaeological digs. They have done some research and done some excavation work, and actually the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah are under the water of the Dead Sea. What did they find? They found a very developed city for that time period. They found what was certainly a very lush and rich lifestyle. But do you know they also found brimstone? God destroyed that city. God destroyed that. You know, these people are not good people. One bad apple spoils a whole bunch. And these are bad people. And Lot, you're becoming more like them. Now, let's look at Abram's speech. This will be verses 8 and 9. 8 and 9. Let's go back and read that one more time. Verse 8 and 9. Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left. Let's look at that. Verse 8. I circled, we are brothers. Abram treats his orphaned nephew as an equal. He's not down here, you do what I tell you have to do. I'm treating you as an equal. Verse 9, the whole land before you. God's affirmation of His promise proves His approval. God has given us the whole land. Pick what you want. You know, God has not said, well, you're going to only have this little part, you can't have that part, you can't have that part. God has given us all of this. Lot, you look over the whole land. Verse 9, please separate from me. Sometimes brothers in faith must separate for the sake of peace. Acts chapter 15. Verse 39. Then the contention. What contention? Barnabas wanted to encourage his cousin John Mark and take him on the second missionary journey. Paul said, I don't think so. He left us on the first one. We can't depend on him. The contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. That's his home area. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. As brothers and sisters, must we agree 100% on things of liberty? Now notice, I didn't say on things of faith. If you disagree that baptism is not essential, I'm sorry, you're not disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with God. But in matters of liberty, if we have a difference, then either we can try to seek a compromise or we may have to separate. We may have to go a different way. That's okay if we depart in love. Did you notice? Lot and Abram departed in love. If we have a problem on an issue of liberty, then either we can try to seek a compromise. A compromise could be 50-50, could be 25-75, it could be 90-10, it could be whatever. A compromise is whatever that works. Or we must separate for the harmony in the family. Paul, in writing to married couples, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, thank you so much. He reminded them, try to work out your differences because that's important. It's important. Now, we're going to stop right there. We're going to look at some of your questions. Coming up on, Lord willing, on Wednesday, we're going to continue this. We're going to look at what the freedom, why Abraham was willing and able to give the choice to Lot. But first, before we do that, let's look at our questions. Okay. I understand that we're not to doubt, but what about the Christians that were put to death by Romans and the apostles who died at the hands of Romans? They believe and didn't fall away from God, yet were persecuted. True. God, if we have learned anything from our study of Revelation that we do on Sunday night, we have learned that God doesn't always give us a bed of roses. He doesn't always rescue us. Like I said, sometimes God stills the storms, and sometimes He comforts His child in the middle of the storm. Sometimes God rescues us out of our problem, out of our situation. He gives us a door of opportunity to go through, and sometimes He just comforts us. So why does He do that? Faith building. Faith building. Why didn't God take away that thorn in the flesh from Paul? Now, we don't know what the thorn was. It could have been, maybe his speech, maybe his reading, eyesight. We don't know what it was. But God did not take it away from him. Why? Because it brought Paul closer to God. It brought Paul closer to God. If what happened to me and the rest of the staff in Paragould had not happened, I wouldn't be here. Tremendous blessing for me to be here. I mean, the biggest, besides my blessing of becoming a Christian and my blessing of marrying Lisa and the blessing of my children and grandchildren, the next biggest blessing. But during that year, during those 6 months, I was devastated, as many other people were. But it caused me to have a stronger faith in God. When we got married, we talked about places we wanted to be and live in. You know what? One of the places that we did not want to live in? Hot Springs, Arkansas. Why? Well, gambling. I've never been that's just something we, never did. We never associated with that. I stayed away from that. God knew what He was doing, and He brought me here. I get to work with Billy, a fantastic partner in ministry, fantastic. Tremendous blessing by being here, getting to work with these elders, with these future elders. Tremendous blessing. God knows what He is doing. So I learned some lessons. God knows what He's doing. One of the times when we were moving, I had this was early in ministry, had all of my notes. Every note I'd had since my days as a teenager was in this one big box marked important. I duct taped it. I made it. The people that was moving us, they remembered putting the box onto the trailer. When we got there, that only that box was missing. Well, we still don't know what happened. Can you imagine being a minister and have all your library notes gone? Another big blessing brought by God, because it forced me to do what? To study fresh. Because I'll give you a little hint. I hate to say this, but as preachers, we all do it. We often depend on what we've done in the past, and we recycle lessons and sermons and things like that. None of my lessons are recycled, because I learned a lesson when that box went missing. I need to keep on studying and doing new. So everything I do is, even if I taught on a book like the book of Acts I'm doing right now, I've taught Acts many times. I'm not using those old notes. I'm studying fresh, because it forces me to take another look at the text. And it forces me to do some more studying. That's it. Get these next lessons if you want them up here. Thank you so much. If you need a notebook, got plenty of notebooks waiting for you right here. You are dismissed. Thank you so very much.